Thanks be to God. God, we thank you that even in the midst of isolation, we declare and we acknowledge that you watch over us. So God, we ask that you watch over this message as well, that this message will be seeds planted all over, where we will be able to move into a place of appreciation of where we are and who we are and whose we are. So God, have your way in this space. Bring us closer to you and bring us closer into community with one another. This is our prayer today, and it is in your name we give thanks and praise. Amen. I'm so grateful for music. I'm so grateful for this team. I'm so grateful for you. And so I just know that the Lord is in this place, and I'm sure you can feel it in your home as well. So I just give thanks for what God is doing in the First UMC community. Thanks be to God. So we are now beginning a new message series entitled Growing Pains. And this is a series designed to name some of the areas in our lives that we may like to improve upon or grow through, both individually and collectively. This message series will also highlight some of the complexities of these growth processes and perhaps point us to some tools or ideas that can or might help us to overcome some of the roadblocks and the challenges that we may experience through these growth processes. And so this week, our lectionary scriptures led me to talk about the growing pains of isolation. For our gospel this morning tells us that once Jesus heard about John the Baptist being tragically beheaded, if I can shape this story for us, the word says that Jesus withdrew into a boat to a deserted place by himself. So in reading this, my first response was to ask myself, would I respond in the same way as Jesus upon hearing news of this magnitude? After all, I can definitely see Jesus' actions from a leadership perspective. Perhaps Jesus did not want the disciples to see his grief or perhaps even anger over the situation. Perhaps Jesus needed a space to sort out his own emotions and thoughts together first before leading and guiding his disciples through this tragedy. Oftentimes, I have found as a leader that when tragedy strikes, people tend to look towards their leader to determine how they too might respond. So Jesus' response does not appear that far-fetched to me from a leadership perspective. But then I can't help but wonder, is this really why Jesus withdrew? For I can't help but notice that Jesus often chose solitude over people. There are 6 times, to be exact, that I'm able to find, and maybe you'll find more, that Jesus chose solitude as a response over people. Number 1, to prepare for a major task. You can find that in the books of Luke chapter 4, around that area. After Jesus was baptized, he spent 40 days praying in the wilderness in isolation. And after this, he was tempted by Satan and then began his public ministry. The second time of isolation, Jesus often isolated to recharge after hard work. And you can find evidence of that in Mark 6. Jesus sent his 12 disciples out to do ministry, and when they returned, he encouraged them to separate from the people who were following them to rest. Solitude, example number 3, Jesus would go into isolation to work through grief. We can find an example of that in Matthew 14, around 1 through 13. After Jesus learned that his cousin John the Baptist had been beheaded, that's our text today, he went away by himself. And yes, we learn that even the Son of God grieves. Solitude example number 4, just in case you're not seeing where I'm going. Jesus, before making any important decision, went into solitude. Early in his ministry, Jesus spent the whole night, can you imagine, the whole night alone in prayer. And the next day, after that prayer, he chose his 12 disciples. That's a whole nother sermon by itself. Before we make any decision, go into isolation, pray about it, then make the decision. Amen. Solitude number 5 example. Jesus would go into isolation in a time of distress. We can find that around Luke 22, the later verses of 39 through 44, if you're with me. Hours before Jesus was arrested, he went to the Mount of Olives and went a short distance away from his disciples to pray. He was in a great emotional agony, knowing what he was about to face. Finally, isolation example number 6, Jesus would often go into solitude to focus on prayer. One example of this can be found in Luke 5:16. It says, many times in Jesus' ministry, he spent time alone in prayer. So those are at least 6 instances where I can find that Jesus chose solitude sometimes over people. So with this observation, the question becomes this, at least for me, and perhaps this resonates with you. Is there something you and I should reconsider when it comes to isolation? Is it all right if I preach this morning? So the reason why I'm choosing the word reconsider is because this pandemic that we are all in, from my perspective, has highlighted the difficulty that it appears that many of us have with isolation. At the beginning of this pandemic, I remember a GIF floating around the internet that said, check on your extrovert friends, for we are not okay. Now, over 4 months in, with no real certainty when it is truly safe to gather again, I would suspect that both introverts and extroverts are not okay. Parents are trying to determine whether their children should do face-to-face learning or remote learning, some because of a financial reality, others because they are concerned about their children being in isolation. People are out and about. Some of us, I don't know if you're guilty of this, but some of us are slowly walking down grocery store aisles. That's me, because there's no real urgency to get home anytime soon, to be met with even more isolation. Can I dare get an amen? Parks, walking and bike trails, lakes and beaches everywhere, heavily populated throughout the globe, because this is another way that I would imagine people have dealt with this impending isolation. People are finding ways to eat safely out of their homes. They're eating outside, sitting out on their porches, entertaining house guests in their backyards, all to overcome this feeling of isolation. So through all of these observations, and I invite you to really explore other ways that we may have been trying to cope through this idea of isolation, it is pretty evident to me that we as human beings are very social, whether we consider ourselves to be extroverts or introverts. You know, regardless of what our Myers-Briggs Enneagram Strength Finder results may reveal, one thing is evident: being quarantined and keeping 6 feet away from one another is not as easy or as ideal as one may think. And yet, getting back to our gospel, it seems that Jesus at times preferred to be in this isolation. He didn't need a government mandate to do that. He didn't need to be told to distance. This was Jesus' go-to. So naturally, where I think you and I might find our wisdom then and instruction on how we may grow through this period of isolation, or how we might deal with the growing pains of isolation, is obviously through Jesus, because Jesus is always the right answer. Amen. But where I also, though, think you and I can learn a lot from this passage, I did not expect it to come this way. Grateful for the revelation, but I think that we can learn not just from Jesus in this passage, but from the crowd. We can learn from the crowd. Because as I jump fully into this text, you and I will notice a shift occur within this passage right away. For the first portion of verse 13 tells us that Jesus withdrew so that he could be alone. But then the second part of this same verse says that when the crowd learned this, they followed him, Jesus, on foot from the city. So in other words, they chose to go into isolation with Jesus. Now, my initial response to the crowd doing this is much kind of like the disciples, if I'm honest. My tendency would have been to be that person to say, hey, let's not disturb Jesus. For Jesus just received some tragic news concerning his friend John and needed time to process. But getting back to the text, the crowd goes to the place, it says anyway, of isolation, where they learned Jesus would be. And the word tells us, watch this, that when Jesus arrived and saw this large crowd basically invading his space of isolation, versus go the other way, versus get annoyed, the text said he had compassion for them and he healed those who were sick. Now, there's two different lessons that I can see happening, and I'm going to just briefly show where I see we can learn from Jesus, but then I'll get to the crowd, I promise. So now Jesus' response, like I said, I think it's a whole nother sermon by itself, but I think there's value in mentioning it. But let's just say that Jesus teaches us in his compassion towards the crowd what it means to embrace the holy disruptions in our life. For in my own life, I've discovered that true ministry often happens in the everyday disruptions in life. It's not in my to-do list. It's always what's in between the to-do list, right? For I have had some amazing God moments when I allowed myself to be interrupted in the grocery store aisles or the parking lots or even working out. I have in those times witnessed powerful prayer moments, people expressing new awakenings and experiences, not to mention people rededicating their lives to walk in the life of Jesus when I allowed myself to be interrupted and responded with a willingness to listen and be made available to them. So we learned a lot from Jesus in this passage, but so I just had to get that nugget out because that could be a word for someone all by themselves. But what I suggest we learn from the crowd, though, let me slow down, is that sometimes you and I have to be willing to go into isolation in order to receive the breakthrough we may have been looking for. Sometimes you and I have to be willing to go into isolation in order to get that prayer answered, in order to get what we really need, in order to get those answers revealed to us. You know, reflecting on our situation today, I don't know about you, but once we make it through this whole COVID nightmare experience, I know that I'm going to be a better person. Can I get an amen if you resonate with that? And although I despise the situation we're in globally with all of the death and the restraints and the economic impact, I will say this, that this time of isolation has presented itself with some opportunities for me, both individually and collectively. And I'm only testifying so that hopefully we can shift a perspective in those who may be feeling a little restless right now. You know, you see, this period of isolation has made me, first of all, value my time with my family even more so. Before COVID, we ate at different times. Now in COVID, we're eating together at the dinner table And I'm so grateful. This period of isolation has invited me to explore new hobbies and re-engage in some hobbies that I've never had time to do before. This period of isolation has strengthened relationships all around me, both on the familial level and professional level. This period of isolation has allowed, from a leadership perspective, a church perspective, it has allowed our church community to enhance our worship and building, not to mention several of us, even in this space right now, have learned new skill sets as it pertains to technology and more. This period of isolation, church, has allowed me personally to be able to address some growing edges within my life, both personally and professionally. And so I share this level of intimacy and self-awareness and observation with you to highlight this point. That if it weren't for this period of isolation, I do not think that I would be where I would be right now. For I would not have had the time or the space to work out on some of the areas in my life that needed some careful attention more than a one-week vacation could ever allot for, that's for sure. So church, I say all this that we can learn from the crowd in our text today. We can learn from their willingness to enter into a time of isolation in the midst of their personal inquiries to have a little talk with Jesus. I would imagine that some of the crowd, as they were walking on foot, were perhaps between a rock and a hard place and needed maybe some guidance. I would imagine, if you're with me in the story, that some of the crowd were in a place of discouragement. I would imagine that some of the crowd had maybe some health concerns or a cancer diagnosis or financial concerns, or they're about to be evicted, or their relationship is about to break up, or their child ran away from home. I would imagine that as they were on foot, this crowd did not know exactly what they were looking for, but they knew that they would find it in that secret place of isolation. And what we do know is that they were willing so much to go into isolation. Again, what I love about them is that they didn't need anyone to tell them to do so, but they did all of this by foot. So there was a desperation as they sought Jesus out. There was this urgency to have something shifted in their life, and they knew that they needed to get this in isolation. And what I love about them, and this is why no matter how long we're in this thing, I know we're going to get through it together, but I am praying for a new perspective on things, because there were no grumblings from the crowd when they were in this isolated place. There were no complaints in the crowd when they were in this isolated place. There was no one worried about anything in this isolated place, but just drawing closer to God and drawing closer to one another. And there is when we see a powerful miracle begin to happen in isolation. Because let me back up a little bit. The crowd teaches us something. They seem to believe in the work of Jesus, all just by what they heard about him, I would imagine. And it was enough for them to travel to this place of isolation to figure out who he was all about. And when the disciples tried to send them off, the urgency of these people were so thick. The word says that Jesus' response was, he could see it, I think, in verse 16. He said, there's no need to send them away. Anyone who's going to follow this far on foot with me, I'm going to help them out, right? But then this is where the miracle happened. Instead of Jesus doing this miracle himself, he begins to teach us the meaning of the isolation period, because he said, you know what? Y'all were stuck on so many ways pre-isolation. Y'all didn't know whether you were coming or going pre-isolation. Your faith was little pre-isolation. So guess what? In isolation, I'm going to teach you something amazing. You give them something to eat. You give them something to eat. Whew. And the passage then shifts to a very well-known story of how they give him something to eat. It's not like going down the street for church's chicken. No, no, no. Jesus gave them a task in isolation with 5 loaves and 2 fish and said, you feed all these people. You feed all these people. And so it is in that place of isolation that everybody around Jesus, I submit, learned that sometimes it takes a period of isolation to really experience the breath of God. Sometimes it takes a period of isolation for us to really experience the sovereignty of God. Sometimes it takes a period of isolation for us to really experience the grace of God. For the word says, here's the miracle, that everyone ate until they were full. But the biggest miracle is Jesus didn't do it all by himself. He empowered the non-grumbling people in isolation to learn how to do it. And they were all full off of these 5 loaves and 2 fish. Not only did everyone eat, but there were 12 baskets filled with the leftovers. So everyone ate off of these 5 loaves and 2 fish. 5,000 men plus women and children ate. So that's thousands, more than that. And all of this happened in the place of isolation. And I believe, just in case you're not already getting excited about a new way of looking at isolation, I believe that it was important for the word to mention that it was an isolated place, so that you and I can begin to understand the importance of why Jesus valued isolation so much in his own life. To teach you and I that great things can happen in the period of isolation. To teach you and I to even be able to slow down just enough so that we can witness the face of God for ourselves. You see, I thought about it. In a more populated setting, it could have been easy to overlook that there were only 5 loaves and 2 fish to begin with. You get that, right? In a more populated setting, it could have been easy to dismiss the lesson that Jesus was trying to teach about their ability with God walking amongst them. So it took this isolated place where everything was slowed down for the people to be able to taste and see that the Lord is good. God's mercy endures forever. So the takeaway is that sometimes it takes a place of isolation for us to truly be able to be awakened and to the person God has been calling us to become, both individually and collectively. And the invitation, as I see it, is for you and I to be able to grasp hold of the prophecy of Isaiah 43:19 that tells us that God is doing a new thing in this place of isolation. Now it springs up. The question that I leave for all of us to wrestle with, like Jacob on the hill of Peniel in our first lesson, is, do we perceive it? Let the church say amen.